Poor William.
Minor characters usually don't have a big impact on a story. They only have a few lines of dialogue, or make a brief appearance in a single scene. While certain minor characters can hold important positions within the world of the story, their interactions with the main cast are minimal at best. However, some characters with a small role turn out to have a huge impact on the narrative, far beyond what a minor character normally ought to have. William the Just is a prime example of this. He doesn't show up in any other games after Blood Omen, but the repercussions of his life and subsequent death in the story ripple across all titles in the Legacy of Kain series.
The legions of the Nemesis are on the march from the north, crushing all in their path. 'Twas not too long ago that the Nemesis was known as William the Just, a caring and gentle benefactor of the land. But as his army grew in strength and he himself grew in power, the veil of tyranny fell, and one kingdom was not enough. So many cities, so many dead. Willendorf will be sure to follow. The Nemesis must be stopped, or all shall be lost.
The first Blood Omen game features an interesting arc involving a tyrant known as the Nemesis, who sought to conquer Nosgoth. The Nemesis fashioned for himself a fanatically loyal and ruthless army. His legions employed brutal methods, leaving a multitude of corpses in their path. The armies enslaved, tortured, and executed any who opposed them. Kain heard tales of these grim events from afar, as did many of the folk in the towns and cities in the west. Although the lives of those beyond the lands of the Nemesis remained unaffected for the most part, much of Nosgoth's populace was aware of the impending threat and the frightening future that awaited them if the Nemesis were to succeed in his goal. Upon first meeting the time streamer Mobius in the guise of an oracle, Kain is reminded of the threat posed by the legions of the Nemesis. Yet the young vampire paid little attention to distant dangers, as he was preoccupied with his quest to destroy the Circle of Nine. Eventually though, as he travelled further east, he was forced to acknowledge and confront the seemingly unstoppable horde. Kain witnessed the devastation of the invaders firsthand when he journeyed through Stalberg. Peasants and warriors alike had been massacred, impaled, and left to rot in the streets. Evidently, the Nemesis had become a vicious torturer and executioner of anyone who stood in his way.
This was once the most academic of cities, housing some of the most prestigious universities in all of Nosgoth. While I would not weep over lost tomes, I detested the sight of scars left upon the world at the hands of the Nemesis.
Counselled by Ariel to rally the forces of Willendorf, Kain recovered the soul of King Otmar's daughter to pull the old king out of his misery and initiate a confrontation between the army of the Last Hope and the Nemesis's legions. The two armies met in the Battle of the Last Stand, with their clash destined to decide the fate of the world.
In the distance I saw the Nemesis armies march forward, a black tide that would soon wash over the armies of the Hope. I sated my thirst on warriors of Horde and Hope alike, the dying relinquishing their final moments to give me strength. They came at me in throngs, no fervor as strong as that inspired by a madman. The Nemesis armies were fierce and showed no signs of subsiding. The tide turned with Otmar's death. I watched as the remaining survivors of the armies of Hope fled to the safety of the forest. The battle had decided its victor. The fate of Nosgoth now lay in the Nemesis' hands.
Ultimately, Willendorf's spirited but meagre army was overwhelmed. Even with Kain's participation in the fray, the legions were too much for the vampire, and soon began closing in on him once King Otmar had fallen. Outnumbered and outmatched, Kain manages to escape by the skin of his teeth when a time-streaming device he'd earlier discovered in Avernus Cathedral activated, sending him back 50 years in the past. The battlefield was gone, and in its place remained a quiet, tranquil field. A city that had fallen to ruin was, in this time period, thriving, peaceful, and full of villagers who admired their beloved king, William the Just. Kain soon discovered that he had been presented with a unique opportunity. If he could kill William before the young king turned into a tyrant, then maybe the Nemesis would never come to exist. Against the earlier council of Vorador, who warned Kain not to meddle in the affairs of men, the vampire entered William's castle, intending to assassinate him. In this time, William the Just was exactly as his title suggested, a genuinely kind, caring, and benevolent benefactor of the kingdom, beloved by his people for his fairness and low tax policies. As a boy king, William inherited the crown early in his life, presumably following the death of his father, the previous sovereign. We can guess that as the Nemesis, he is roughly 60 to 70 years old in the later Blood Omen era, quite a respectable age for a ruler living in medieval days. Unfortunately, like many medieval leaders thrusted into a position of power at a young age, William is naive and susceptible to manipulation. When Mobius arrived in William's realm, addressing and rallying crowds of villagers with spiteful speeches against Nosgoth's vampire populace, his reception among the peasantry earned him an audience with the king, and in the king's stronghold, the two meet for the first time.
Yes, these weapons you have provided will see to that. Pray tell, Mobius, what game do you play?
None, my lord. I only wish to aid you in vanquishing your foes. The weapons are but a token of my goodwill.
And the news you bring, a vampire sent to slay me? Where did you come upon such knowledge?
'Tis of no consequence, sire. It was only out of concern for your majesty's life.
Perhaps. Very well, then. You may leave me now, but should I wish to speak to you...
I will know, your majesty, and I shall be there in time.
Tony J was cast as William for the original Blood Omen, which I have to say was a curious choice by the developers, given that William is only supposed to be a boy king here. As we know, Tony has a deep, commanding voice that is perfectly suited for illustrious characters like Mortanius and the Elder God, but not so appropriate for a character that was written to be very young and naive. I can see why some fans consider there to be something of a vocal dissonance here. On the other hand, I think Tony's voice would have perfectly suited an older William as the Nemesis had we gotten any scenes with him. William only makes a brief appearance in Blood Omen, but his few lines of dialogue does reveal a bit of his personality. Despite being convinced of Mobius's good intentions, he is mildly suspicious of the Time Streamer. Many boy kings throughout real-world history are often accompanied by advisors who exert a certain corrupting influence over their sovereigns. Had Kain not interfered when he did, it is clear that Mobius would have continued to have played on William's fears. We can see that when William dismissed Mobius, the young king was anxious to speak with him again, showing that even from their first encounter, Mobius's words resonated with William, despite his suspicions. Perhaps also receiving the Soul Reaver blade was enough to persuade William to take the old man on as his advisor. Over a long period of time, I can imagine Mobius planting seeds of distrust, pushing the king to suspect betrayal and attempts on his life from every corner of his realm, even from his own allies. Such doubts would have consumed him, leading the once righteous king to become cruel with a hunger for conquest. It was not directly stated in-game that William wielded the Soul Reaver against Kain during their battle, but Silicon Knights confirmed he was in their guide. Although Soul Reaver 2 would later go on to emphasize that both Kain and William had each armed themselves with the sword, Blood Omen didn't establish the necessity of the Reaver to initiate a change in history. I always found it pretty neat how director Amy Hennig retroactively uses William's duel with Kain to explain how time travel works in her Soul Reaver series. In Blood Omen, it was extremely difficult to kill William with any weapon other than the future incarnation of the Soul Reaver Kain possessed. In fact, while William can be defeated with weapons other than the Soul Reaver, it takes an extremely long time to do so, and using the notorious sword is by far the most effective means to win. Even if it was a coincidence, it's kinda cool to see that Blood Omen forced this event to happen in the way that it is later described in the series, as I reckon most players would have ended up equipping Kain with the one weapon that worked best to wear down the high HP damage sponge boss. Their fight was chaotic, but Kain triumphed in the end, breaking William's sword in two and drinking the would-be tyrant's blood. This convergence of the two Reavers changed history, removing the Nemesis and his conquering legions from the timeline. However, the altered present was not at all what the vampire expected. When he was back in his own time, he discovered that William had been martyred by Nosgoth's human populace and served as the catalyst of an entirely different massacre, a war that nearly wiped out all of Nosgoth's vampires, leaving Kain as the sole survivor of his race. With their sainted king dead by Kain's hand, Mobius rallied the people into exterminating the vampires out of vengeance for William. All along, William had been little more than a pawn, a piece on the board for Mobius to use and then throw away after he got what he wanted. His death gave Mobius the leverage he needed to utterly devastate the vampire species. What I find most interesting about all this though is that it is strongly implied Mobius created a new timeline by actually transforming William into the Nemesis to begin with.
Ironic. By going back in time and altering the past, you turned William the Just into the Nemesis.
Aye, you have seen my plan, vampire, as I've seen your destiny. The future says you die.
But I am dead. As are you.
This scene indicates that there was indeed an earlier timeline where William remained every bit the benign, caring ruler, free of Mobius's insidious designs. This means that what we know to be Timeline 1 in the game's chronology is at the very least the second timeline. It's firmly established that the key to changing the past lies in the paradoxical meeting of two incarnations of the Soul Reaver in time and space. Given this rule, I'm genuinely curious about how Mobius altered the past to transform the virtuous William into a tyrant. We know that his method had to somehow involve the Soul Reaver, and possibly the presence of the Wraith Raziel, who, let's be honest, is basically a walking paradox, thanks to his future self being affixed to his arm. If you guys have any theories about how Mobius was able to trigger this chain of events, please let me know, as I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this earlier timeline, since we only hear about it but never get to see it in game. William's legacy would continue to endure long after his death. In Soul Reaver 2, his backstory takes centre stage and plays a fundamental role in explaining how time in Nosgoth actually works.
So this was the tomb of the beloved King William the Just, beatified here as the martyr and catalyst of Mobius's crusade. I was reminded of Kain's journey as a fledgling vampire, how Mobius coerced him to travel back in history and assassinate William, thus igniting a genocidal hatred of vampires among the citizens of Nosgoth.
Travelling backwards through history, Raziel explored Nosgoth when the vampire hunters were at the height of their campaign. During his search of the Sarafan stronghold, Raziel stumbled across a shrine of the martyred king. Apparently, Mobius had arranged for William's corpse to be conveyed here, where it served as an altar to inspire ordinary folk to become true believers of the crusade against the vampires. For his Soul Reaver 2 depiction, William's appearance was worked on by artist Daniel Cabuco, who took the original evil spiky red armour and reinterpreted it to incorporate a rose theme. It didn't make much sense for a young boy king, renowned for his justice and fairness, to be parading around with evil red armour and black horns. A rose-themed outfit suited the character perfectly, and Cabuco tweaked William's appearance in the stained glass mural to show him with more thorn-like spikes. Raziel was somewhat familiar with William's story, yet he only comes to truly understand the full implications of William's life and death when he discovers Kain standing before the fallen king's sarcophagus.
How do we explain William here? The beloved boy king turned tyrant. In my youth, I witnessed William's rise to power and his transformation into the Nemesis who laid waste to Nosgoth. Keep your distance, Kain. Years later, I stumble upon a chance to journey back in history, unaware that the entire affair has been carefully orchestrated by Mobius. In my wisdom, I seize this opportunity to murder the young king before he can ravage Nosgoth, and thereby provide the catalyst Mobius needs to ignite a genocidal war against our race.
Kain described the immutable nature of history to Raziel. He related the story of how he journeyed back in time and fought William before he could brutalize Nosgoth, only to discover that by killing William, he fashioned himself into a tyrant among the common folk who adored their king. The presence of two Reavers, Kain explained, was the key to changing history. Raziel now had a choice to make, as at this very instant, time decided he was meant to kill Kain here. Yet Kain's words and story about William encouraged Raziel to resist the pull of history as it tried to force his hand. With great difficulty, Raziel decided to spare Kain, smashing the sword downward and impaling William's tomb with the Reaver instead. Even though he doesn't physically show up in this title, the tragedy of William's destiny had an enormous impact on our main characters. For Kain, his encounter with William was a constant reminder for the vampire to take heed when travelling through the past so as not to fall victim to any further fatal paradoxes that could unravel history around him. For Raziel, the telling of William's tale influenced his decision to spare Kain, while also showing him that his free will had a huge role to play in restoring Nosgoth. Hey, thanks for taking the time out of your day to check out this video. Time is one of the most precious things we have, and the fact that you have decided to spend it here listening to me going on about a relatively minor lock character means a lot. Like if you enjoyed the vid, subscribe for more fantasy content, and I'll see you all later. Cheers everyone.